In 1930, the United States passed a tariff law and helped ignite what many historians now call a commercial war. One prominent economic historian, Charles Kindleberger, argued that this moment was a key factor in the unraveling of the world economy, and that breakdown in turn played a critical role in Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany. The logic behind that claim is chilling, but straightforward. When international trade collapsed, financial systems cracked, unemployment exploded, and anger spread. Out of that anger, extremist politics stopped being theoretical and started feeling like a solution. People in crisis become willing to consider ideas they would normally reject. That is exactly what played out in Germany in the early 1930s. And that is why, whenever we see nations move aggressively toward tariffs and economic isolation today, we should probably stop and ask ourselves if we're watching the first act of a story we've seen before. To understand how the world got there, we need to rewind to the 1920s. The decade is often called the Roaring Twenties, and from the surface, the name made sense. The United States was the world's industrial supercharger. Output was up. Consumer culture was booming. Average GDP growth sat at a healthy pace of more than 4% per year. Factories were humming, radios and cars were spreading into middle-class life, stocks were rising, and American business leaders spoke with total confidence about endless expansion. On paper, it looked like prosperity had found cruise control. But under those glowing numbers, there were structural cracks that kept getting wider. Wealth was becoming more concentrated, debt levels, both personal and corporate, kept climbing, and one of the most politically sensitive groups in America at the time, farmers, were already struggling. And that last part really matters, because farmers in the 1920s were not a small special interest group. They were a massive voting bloc. Today, farmers in the United States make up a tiny single-digit share of the total population. In the late 1920s, roughly a fifth of all Americans still lived off the land. That meant agriculture wasn't just an industry, it was a political force. During World War I, farms in the U.S. had essentially been feeding not just America, but much of Europe too. With European farmland damaged, disrupted, or under military occupation, demand for American crops spiked. American farmers borrowed heavily to buy more land, more equipment, more seed. They scaled up to meet that wartime demand. But after the war ended, Europe slowly repaired, restarted domestic production, and no longer needed American grain at the same panic levels. The global supply picture shifted. Prices for U.S. crops fell hard. That price collapse was devastating at ground level. A field that once produced enough income to pay the mortgage and maybe even put money aside for new machinery could suddenly barely cover operating costs. But the bank didn't care that corn or wheat was now selling for far less. The loans still had to be paid. Every harvest was turning into a math problem that didn't add up. By the late 1920s, farm foreclosures were no longer isolated tragedies. They were a spreading reality. So farmers began to organize. Agricultural unions and lobbying groups launched coordinated pressure campaigns. They wrote letters to Congress in huge volume. They staged protests. They warned that without protection from cheaper foreign imports, especially agricultural imports, they'd be wiped out. Their ask was simple to describe, even if the consequences would turn out to be much less simple. They wanted tariffs. They wanted the government to step in, put a tax on foreign agricultural goods coming into the country, and raise the floor under domestic prices so American farms could survive. Herbert Hoover heard them. Hoover ran for president in 1928 as a Republican and campaigned in part on the promise that he would defend U.S. farmers. He said he would support raising tariffs on agricultural imports to shield them from foreign competition. This was not a small pledge. This was a direct appeal to a huge and politically active base, at a moment when the national economy still looked strong from a distance. But certain communities, especially rural ones, were already in real pain. Before we go forward, though, let's pause on one basic concept, because it matters for everything that follows. What exactly is a tariff? In simple terms, a tariff is a tax. A government puts on goods that are imported from abroad. If a U.S. company imports, for example, maple syrup from Canada, and there's a tariff in place on that syrup, then the importer has to pay that tax to the U.S. government when it brings that syrup across the border. In theory, the idea is to make foreign goods more expensive, so domestically produced goods become more competitive. Politicians who defend tariffs usually say that tariffs help protect our workers, protect our producers, or protect our national industries. But here's the catch. Even though the tariff is paid by the importer technically, companies almost never just eat that cost out of kindness. They raise prices. And the end consumer often pays more. So, while tariffs can help a local industry survive, they can also raise prices in stores. The political story is, we're defending jobs. The economic story and practice is often, we're making certain everyday items more expensive for regular people. Now back to Hoover, he won the presidency. But the timing could not have been worse. As we approached the end of the 1920s, the mood in the United States had quietly shifted from unstoppable optimism to creeping anxiety. The Federal Reserve, concerned that markets were overheating and that speculative behavior was getting out of control, began tightening monetary policy. Interest rates rose. That helped cool down the stock frenzy, but also slowed the broader economy. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashed. The panic didn't stay on Wall Street. It bled directly into the real economy. Credit tightened, spending fell, production slowed. By late 1929, the United States had slid into a serious downturn. This was not yet called the Great Depression. That label would come a bit later. But the direction of travel was ugly. Hoover took office in the middle of all this. Now he faced a brutal dilemma. He had promised support to farmers, and they expected to be rescued. At the same time, the country was heading into crisis. He needed to show he was doing something. So he did what he said he would do. He asked Congress to raise tariffs on agricultural imports. The original idea, at least as Hoover pitched it, was narrow. He wasn't proposing to wall off the entire U.S. economy from the rest of the world. He was focusing on farm goods. He wanted targeted relief. But Washington, as always, had other plans. In the House, the key player was Willis C. Hawley, who chaired the Ways and Means Committee. In the Senate, it was Reed Smoot, who chaired the Finance Committee. These two men believed that if tariff protection was good for one sector, why not extend it to other sectors as well? Industry groups noticed the door was open and began lining up. Lobbyists from manufacturing, textiles, chemicals, and more all argued that their industries, too, deserved protection from foreign competition. The bill that began as a tool to stabilize farm incomes quickly expanded into something much broader. A sweeping tariff increase across a huge range of imported goods. This is how what became known as the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was born. There was resistance. A bloc made up of progressive Republicans and most Democrats saw danger immediately. They warned that if the United States, which at that point was one of the most important consumer markets in the world, suddenly raised tariffs across the board, other countries would strike back. And they wouldn't just strike back symbolically. They would retaliate with their own tariffs against American exports. That, in turn, could crush U.S. manufacturers who relied on foreign buyers. These critics tried every procedural move in the playbook stall tactics, endless amendments, long debates to slow or kill the bill. But as the economy worsened and fear spread, protectionist arguments got more politically attractive. Protect American jobs is a lot easier to sell to a scared public than maintain global trade efficiency. When people are losing work, slogans about national self-reliance become powerful. The protectionist wing used the crisis as leverage. The vote was close in the Senate, but the measure passed there. In the House, where Republicans held a stronger majority, it passed by a more comfortable margin. And suddenly, the final decision landed in front of President Hoover himself. This is the moment where the story moves from domestic economics to global consequences. All through this debate in Washington, the rest of the world had been watching closely and nervously. You have to remember where Europe stood at the end of the 1920s. The First World War had ended just a decade earlier. Many European economies were still rebuilding. Germany, in particular, was in a uniquely fragile state. After World War I, the Weimar Republic, the democratic government that took power in Germany after the Kaiser abdicated, had been forced to accept huge reparations payments. Those reparations were essentially financial penalties demanded by the Allied powers. To make those payments and to stabilize its currency after a period of extreme hyperinflation, Germany relied heavily on loans from American banks. U.S. money was keeping large pieces of the German economy on life support. That meant that any U.S. policy that damaged global trade, any shock that spread panic through financial markets, Any move that made American creditors nervous, all of it could ripple straight into Germany's already strained political system. And this is where the tariff fight becomes more than just an argument about farm prices. It becomes a hinge in global history. Before Hoover signed the bill, economists tried one last time to stop him. Paul Douglas, an economist from the University of Chicago, who would later enter politics himself, helped organize an extraordinary petition. It was signed by roughly 1,000 economists from across the country. In calm but urgent language, they told the White House that this tariff plan would almost certainly backfire. They predicted higher consumer prices, an international trade war, and a collapse in export markets. They warned that this wouldn't just hurt America, it would destabilize the world economy. At the same time, formal diplomatic protests poured in from other nations. By late 1929, more than 20 countries had either formally complained or directly warned that retaliation was coming. Canada, the United States' largest trading partner, made it clear that if America raised barriers, Canada would respond in kind. Several European countries threatened boycotts of U.S. goods. These were not empty gestures. Trade relationships in that era were a lifeline. For many countries, especially those still rebuilding from the war, access to the U.S. market was crucial. Hoover had options. He could have vetoed the bill, sent it back to Congress, and insisted on a narrower, more targeted version that addressed specific pain points in agriculture without igniting a larger confrontation. He did not take that route. On June 17, 1930, Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act into law. The timing could not possibly have been worse. Once the tariffs went into effect, global trade partners responded quickly. Other countries imposed counter-tariffs of their own. International trade slowed, then choked. The United States had already been dealing with recession and the aftermath of the market crash. Smoot-Hawley turned that slowdown into something far more severe by helping to shut down a key release valve: exports. Here is what that looked like in numbers. U.S. imports fell sharply over the next 2 years. Depending on how you measure it, the value of goods coming into the country dropped from billions of dollars in 1929 to just a fraction of that by 1932. Overall global trade volumes collapsed by well over half in just a few years. American farms, the very group that tariffs were supposed to rescue, were now facing an even smaller world market. Other countries, hit by U.S. protectionism, no longer wanted, or in some cases could no longer afford, to buy American agricultural exports. Farm export revenue plunged even further. Factories inside the United States began to feel the next wave of pain. When international orders dried up, production lines slowed or shut down. Workers were laid off. Towns that had depended on manufacturing contracts linked to overseas buyers suddenly had no buyers at all. The shock didn't just stay on the coasts or in the big cities. It spread all the way into the interior, into steel towns and textile towns and shipping hubs. The crisis went national. Now let's connect this to Germany again, because this part is critical. Once the U.S. economy began seizing up, U.S. lenders started recalling their loans from Germany. This wasn't done with malicious intent toward Germany. It was done out of desperation. American banks were trying to save themselves. But from the German perspective, this was catastrophic. Credit vanished. Businesses in Germany failed. Banks there collapsed. Unemployment in Germany exploded. Within just a few years, millions of Germans were out of work. By the early 1930s, unemployment in Germany was approaching a third of the total labor force. That level of mass unemployment doesn't just create hardship. It creates rage. It creates a vacuum. And vacuums get filled. Into that vacuum stepped a political movement that promised certainty, direction, national pride, and revenge. Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazi Party had been on the fringes of German politics through most of the 1920s. They were loud, they were extreme, but they were not dominant. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis received only a tiny share of the national vote. Most Germans did not take them seriously yet. But when the German economy collapsed, when banks failed, when jobs vanished, when people watched their savings disappear, when humiliation felt permanent, the political map changed. The Nazis' message, built on nationalism, scapegoating, and promises of restored strength, suddenly resonated with millions. By 1932, they were the single largest political party in Germany. And, in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor. Now, obviously U.S. tariffs did not cause Hitler. History is more complicated than that. German political culture, resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, pre-existing anti-Semitism and militarism, infighting among mainstream parties, and elite maneuvering all played central roles in his rise. But it is also true that the global economic breakdown accelerated by the Smoot-Hawley Tariff helped create exactly the conditions in which radicalism could win power. When people are plunged into desperation, they get more willing to gamble on extremists who claim to have simple answers. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Back in the United States, Hoover paid a political price. The downturn had now transformed into the Great Depression in full force. By 1932, he was deeply unpopular. Franklin Delano Roosevelt ran against him, promising a New Deal, a new approach to both domestic crisis and international economics. Roosevelt won, and not narrowly. The election was a rejection of Hoover's policies, including his handling of trade. Even in Congress, the architects of the tariff Smoot and Hawley themselves lost their seats. The public verdict was loud. Roosevelt's approach after taking office in 1933 was not instant magic, but it was different in strategy. Instead of doubling down on isolation, Roosevelt moved toward rebuilding trade relationships through negotiation. Over time, the United States shifted from the aggressive unilateral tariff model toward a more managed system of reciprocal trade agreements. The idea was to reduce barriers step by step, stabilize currency relationships, and rebuild a predictable global trading environment. Eventually, that gradual process of lowering barriers and creating shared rules would evolve into a broader international order institutions, agreements, and norms designed to keep trade flowing and prevent the kind of beggar-thy-neighbor spiral that had helped turn a recession into a worldwide catastrophe. That long arc shaped the post-war world. After World War II, organizations and frameworks were built to keep markets interconnected and to resolve disputes without every disagreement turning into a tariff war. Over the decades, large trade agreements and institutions tried to make sure global commerce ran on something closer to rules instead of raw power. The logic was simple. When economies are linked, wars are more costly, and extremist politics have a harder time feeding off total collapse. But now let's talk about why any of this matters today. In recent years, we've seen a clear political comeback of tariff-driven thinking. The argument being made now sounds very familiar. Foreign competition has hollowed out domestic industries. Certain trade agreements have sent factories overseas. Working-class communities have been abandoned. And the only way to rebuild domestic strength is to protect national industries with aggressive tariffs. Deals like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, have been accused for decades of sending manufacturing jobs to lower-wage countries. Critics argue that whole regions in the United States lost their economic base because big companies found it cheaper to set up production elsewhere, import those goods back in, and pocket the difference. The counter-argument, which is also real, is that open trade has produced cheaper goods for consumers, encouraged specialization and efficiency, and helped U.S. companies expand abroad. Both of those ideas can be true at the same time. Free trade can increase total national wealth overall, while concentrating a lot of the negative impact like job losses on specific towns. And those towns vote. That tension is what's back on the table now. When modern American leaders talk about new sweeping tariffs, when they talk about broad national economic security and punishing trade actions, they are tapping into a very old instinct: protect the home market. They are also, whether they acknowledge it or not, flirting with the same global dynamics we saw in 1930. Because other countries do not just quietly accept being hit with tariffs, they respond. Trade war is not a metaphor. It is literally a sequence of moves and counter-moves that can spiral. We have already seen markets react sharply to tariff announcements in the present era. We've watched share prices swing, we've watched companies publicly warn about higher input costs, and we've watched investors try to model what happens if supply chains that stretch across continents suddenly get interrupted by policy. We've also seen escalating tensions specifically between the United States and China. The U.S. economy is deeply intertwined with Chinese manufacturing. American businesses rely on Chinese-made components, electronics, machinery, and more. When tariffs are imposed on those imports, that cost doesn't just vanish. It moves. It moves into prices, into margins, into wages, into where companies choose to build in the future. Here's why this should make us think, not just react emotionally. In 1930, the U.S. thought it could raise tariffs to defend domestic jobs, and that other countries would grumble but ultimately live with it. Instead, the world responded, trade collapsed, credit chains broke, and by 1932, Germany was in social freefall. Out of that freefall emerged one of the most destructive regimes in human history. That is not ancient, irrelevant trivia. That is within living memory of our great-grandparents' generation. The lesson here is not all tariffs are bad forever in every form. Reality is more nuanced than that. Sometimes targeted tariffs can be used strategically to respond to dumping, to address national security risks in sensitive industries, or to force negotiation when a trading partner is openly breaking rules. The lesson also is not free trade is perfect and painless. It obviously is not. Whole communities in multiple countries have been gutted by rapid globalization, and pretending otherwise is dishonest. People who live through that hollowing out have every right to demand answers. The real lesson is about scale, speed, and escalation. When a powerful country takes a broad, aggressive, protectionist turn, especially during a moment of economic stress, it doesn't just change prices in stores. It can destabilize entire systems. Financial flows can seize up. Export markets can vanish. Political pressure inside other countries can spike in ugly directions. And into that pressure, history tells us, step movements that promise simple answers, total national renewal, and enemies to blame. So, when we talk today about shutting borders economically, about tearing up trade structures that have been in place for decades, about waging large-scale tariff battles in the name of national strength, we are not just debating policy. We are playing with historical explosives. That is why the story of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act still matters. It started with a promise to protect American farmers. It ended up helping to fracture the global economy at one of the most delicate moments in modern history. It poured gasoline on a worldwide depression. And in that depression, political extremism didn't just grow, it won. This is the connection we cannot afford to ignore. Economic policy can turn into political reality faster than we think. A tariff that looks on paper like a domestic adjustment can, under the wrong conditions, become one of the steps on the path toward authoritarianism somewhere else in the world. The link between pocketbook pain and radical politics is not abstract. We've seen it. And that brings us to now. We live in a world that is even more interconnected than the world of 1930. Supply chains span dozens of countries. Financial markets move money across the planet in seconds. Production is global by default. That means the ripple effects of economic nationalism today would move even faster and hit even more places at once than they did almost a century ago. So, here's the question we all have to sit with. If we repeat the logic of 1930 on a 2020s global economy, do we really think the outcome will be cleaner? Or are we just pretending we've learned from history while walking straight toward it again? I want to hear your view. How do you think a large-scale tariff confrontation in the current climate would reshape not just prices and jobs, but political stability in different parts of the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you made it all the way here, leave a $ emoji so I know you're one of the people who actually sticks around for the whole argument. Also, if you haven't yet, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And if you want more context, I've also done a full breakdown on both the Roaring '20s and the Great Depression, which tie directly into what we've been talking about here.